Mark Richt and the University of Georgia have mutually parted ways, but of course we know better. We bring in David Waters from Gator Sports Radio, who tracks the SEC each and every day. And another situation, David, where a very successful head coach wins football games consistently over a period of time. We saw the rumors put to rest concerning Les Miles. I'll put Mark Richt in the same category in certain respects, minus the national championship. Winning consistently, but maybe not winning the right games at the right time and not winning enough for the demand at Georgia.
Yeah, I think you pretty much nailed it there. Right games at the right time, and that can go a couple avenues there. Mark Richt didn't have a lot of success against Florida. He had a losing record. Only faced Steve Spurrier once, but lost that game. He kind of surprised. Only beat Zook, only Ron Zook when he coached Florida 1 year out of the 3 years he coached that game. Struggled against Urban Meyer as well. Had a winning record against Muschamp, and then lost this past year against McElwain. And then also that goes back to not being able to beat your main rival in conference, but also the SEC East has been down for the last few seasons, and Missouri was the team that was representing the SEC East, and now this year Florida, when Georgia was picked. I think Georgia has been picked to win the East 3 out of the last 4 seasons, and they haven't been in the SEC championship game since 2012, haven't won one since 2005. So that's very, that weighed a lot. I'm pretty sure on athletic director Greg McGarity, and I guess it has run its course. A lot of Georgia fans were behind Mark Richt. He was a stand-up guy. He made his players better gentlemen. As they would say. But we know in major college football, the bottom line is winning. All that other stuff, yes, it matters, but what's going to keep your job is the W's. In the win column.
I think you hit it exactly, David. If Georgia was in the SEC Western Division, there would be a little bit of leeway for going 9-3, 10-3 consistently, because Alabama is the gold standard basically in college football, certainly in the SEC. And then you've got a handful of programs, certainly LSU and Auburn most years, that are top 10 programs. But in the SEC Eastern Division, considering the plight of Florida in recent years, minus the 2012 team, Missouri winning back-to-back championships, that's a bit hard to take when you're a Georgia program that's used to winning, that probably considers, based on the talent, the resources, the facilities, the money that they have there at Georgia, that pretty much anybody can show up, and Georgia's going to walk on the field and win 8 games automatically without breaking a sweat. They're more talented than 7 or 8 teams easily on their schedule. So the one knock I have against Mark Richt during his tenure was, mention the game, find the game where Georgia was a considerable underdog and he outcoached the other guy and they played over their heads and they won a huge game. I think maybe his most impressive effort was in a losing cause in the 2012 championship game against the best team in the country, Alabama, where they pretty much proved that they were the second best team in the country, and that was in a loss. So it was just repeatedly losing games, winning all the games, almost all the games that they were supposed to win, not ever beating anybody they weren't supposed to win. And then usually there was one game a year where you were like, okay, they shouldn't have lost that one. And they really fell off the radar early. They were supposed to compete with Alabama, got blown out, and then they were completely off the radar the rest of this season. So it's disappointing that the standard's that high, but that's why SEC coaches in particular and top coaches across the country get paid as much as they do. They're supposed to win and win championships.
Right, and look at the changes Georgia has went through the last couple of seasons. They brought in Jeremy Pruitt, last year at defensive coordinator. That was supposed to, amp up, get the kind of stoic Mark Richt. That was supposed to, Pruitt was brought in to, bring a little bit of fire to it. The defense has been better, but then you look at, the unexplainable loss to Florida last year and Georgia Tech last year, and then another Florida loss this year. In this past season, Mike Bobo went to Colorado State to take over for Jim McElwain, and then that offense really hasn't, under Schottenheimer, hasn't really looked the same at all. Of course, a lot of that can contribute to Nick Chubb going down. But, last year it happened to, Todd Gurley missed a few games with injuries. And then so he was suspended for, a lot of the games early in the year. And then he got hurt when he came back. So, and they had some experience with Chubb. But, that offense was still clicking for the most part under Bobo, and a lot of flack, got flung Bobo's way as he was offensive coordinator. But, a lot of Georgia fans were wishing they had him this past year. But, that's what it was. All these changes that were supposed to help Mark Richt. And 9-3 is, like you said, it's not a bad season. But given, how down the SEC East was this year, and then Florida ends up winning it when, they were picked fifth, and then, Georgia, who was picked to win, just, lost to Tennessee, lost to Florida, games that they just, weren't supposed to lose. So, the fans had been clamoring for years, some fans saying he was never going to win the big one. And it turns out, a lot of fans have really now gotten their wish.
And it's unfortunate, David, because I think it's easy for us to see across the country a number of top coaches that are winning championships, winning games, and we may not feel the best about their ethical standards, or there may not be a whole lot of proof, but it's somewhat in question. And I never thought that was the case with Mark Richt. He seems to be a decent guy who is strong in his faith, strong in his family values, is the type head coach that you would want your son to go play for and be under his wing for 4 or 5 years. And that's been the case with Mark Richt. Very little, I should say, any type of hint of scandal or anything going on. There's a lot of players running around. They're going to do stupid things. So that's always going to be the case anywhere. But for the most part, Mark Richt running a very clean program there at Georgia, by all accounts, won 145 games. That's second to Vince Dooley. As you mentioned, he just churned out 9 and 10 win teams, but couldn't win the big one at the right time, and unfortunately ran into that 2012 Alabama team. So who do you think is possibly the next coach in Athens?
I think there's 2 main names to look at. Defensive coordinator at Alabama, Kirby Smart, has some Georgia ties. Do they go the coordinator route and try and go that route? And though now Greg McGarity, who is the athletic director at Georgia, was an assistant to Jeremy Foley, athletic director at Florida, and apparently has some ties to Dan Mullen. And it has, there are some sources who have said Dan Mullen has said Georgia is a dream job to him. So we would see, it's a good coach. And, part of Mark Richt, a lot of what people were throwing towards Mark Richt was getting talent at Georgia was never a problem. Georgia is right up there, in the top 5, top 4, top 5, 6, states to get talent from. So that was never an issue, talent at Georgia. So that's, probably part of the reason. So whoever does come in will have plenty to work with. Can they keep this current class that Georgia has, highly touted quarterback recruit Jacob Eason? Can they, whoever comes in, can they keep him? From all accounts, he wants to be a Georgia Bulldog, so it probably doesn't matter who the coach is. But if you were to ask me, I think you got 2 names, Kirby Smart and Dan Mullen. Does Tom Herman now maybe take a look? Georgia, this job is considered a top tier job for and talent. I brought in, I brought up just a second ago is one of the main reasons why, and in the SEC, and they'll spend money. So Georgia can probably really go out and get whoever they want. So who they want. Like I said, do they go to coordinator route, or do they go to more proven route?
It's USC and it's Georgia. Those are jobs 1A and 1B that are vacant right now in college football during the offseason. And because of them being in different regions of the country, they may allure different candidates. But to your point, there was a study released that I came across a couple months ago that because of population and because of the talent in the South, Atlanta has more top Division I players, FBS players, and NFL players who grew up and played high school football in that surrounding area than any place in the country. David Waters from Gator Sports Radio. This guy knows more about the SEC, as you can hear, and specifically that rival Georgia Bulldogs football program than anybody I know. Thanks, David. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Mark.